Welcome back to New House, Old Soul. Talking today about electrical. Come join me today on New House, Old Soul.
Build Original Series, hosted by Brent Hull. New House, Old Soul. Sponsored by Stellar Floors and the Unico System.
Really, the first and early electricity is more about lighting than it is about power equipment or home appliances. Really, we're talking in the 1880s, 1890s, this early era of electricity. Now, interestingly, AC/DC were at odds. It was called the War of the Currents. You had Thomas Edison on one side really pushing for DC, direct current power, and you had Westinghouse on the other side pushing for AC, alternating current. These two were fighting each other and suing each other and backstabbing each other and sending bad reports to the newspaper that everybody was going to die if you used this other style. There's a few good books about it. There's one called The Empires of Light, which one I read, and there's another one called Current Wars. It's interesting because guys that names that we're familiar with today, Tesla worked for George Westinghouse in the AC side. And of course, Thomas Edison and General Electric were on the DC side. They were trying to light the cities, and the problem that DC had was that it couldn't go very far, but the AC was more powerful, but it was dangerous. There was all these competing things back and forth. I mean, the first electric chair was part of the current wars. So it's in a crazy time, that 1880s, 1890s time period when electricity was going on. Because realize there was other things competing for lighting up things. There was gas lighting. Gas companies were all working to try to be the first in the home, the standard by which things were done. You know, gas lighting that you'd see maybe in London in the late 19th century. So McFarland, it's a beautiful, wonderful house. They have what's called gasoliers, a light that you had a gas valve and basically a flame shot out the end, which seems crazy to me, not only for the carbon dioxide, but just the fumes and the smoke and the grittiness. Really would have been a dirty way to light the house. Then there was the dual gasolier and then also electrical. That's real safe, right? You have the electrical and the gas going at the same time. There was many different ways that people were thinking about lighting their houses. And the early light bulbs of the 1900s were often very low wattage, and so maybe a 20 watt today, so they didn't get very bright. Then there's some developments that take place and they start brightening up. Realize too, guys, that electricity in the houses doesn't really kind of take hold until after 1910. If you're in an old house, the first really type of wiring that took place was called knob and tube wiring. Knob and tube was basically two wires that were sometimes covered with a rubber, sometimes covered with a cloth. They're about 6 inches apart, and when they were drilled through a stud, there was a porcelain tube that was stuck through the wood, and the wire would run through the tube. The knob was a porcelain knob that would be nailed down and driven into, and these wires would get pulled across, wrapped around the knob, and then strung out to the other parts of the house. It's fairly labor intensive. There weren't a lot of electrical appliances and plugs and outlets in those early houses, but there were some. And it's interesting because the knob and tube wiring gets replaced by the Romex, okay, the plastic things that we use today with the two wires and the ground wire. Interestingly, the ground wire didn't show up to like the 40s or 50s, so for a long time it was just the two wires going through the house that were wrapped in plastic. It took over knob and tube because it was easier to install. So if you look at an old house and you go to it and you only see the two prongs, you don't have the grounding cable, it was probably done before 1940. The number of things that we put into houses really doesn't start changing probably till the rise of air conditioning in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I remember a lot of houses that we would go into, the 30 and 60 amp boxes with the screw-in breakers. That lasts until the 50s or 60s. Then you start to go to the breaker that we use today with the breaker boxes. Now, if you happen to own a Federal Pacific box, okay, you need to get rid of that. They actually cause fires. It was done in the 50s and 60s, so be careful if you have a Federal Pacific breaker box. 65 to 75, you had aluminum wiring. Copper got very expensive. These companies came out with aluminum wiring. Aluminum wiring does not handle the heat very well, and you need to get rid of that as well. So all these developments, I tell you all that because a lot of the things that we're dealing with today are really only in the last 40, 50 years that a lot of those things have become standardized and part of how we build. So really when you're talking new house, old soul, and really talking power and electricity, I'm really talking about lighting. That's really the piece that is that old soul dial that helps communicate this quality and beauty and historicity, okay, that is appropriate. Just probably 20 years ago, we would blow up a ceiling with a bunch of can lights, and even the ceiling in my house has too many can lights as we look at it today. And so how do we get rid of those things? How do we stop doing things that date itself? Because in 20 years, we're gonna look back at that can light and go, what were we thinking? Why did we blow up our ceilings with all these can lights? One of the things that I think made the Pennsylvania farmhouse so successful for us was that 90% of the lighting in that house is historic lighting. There isn't hardly any can lights in that house. Most of it is decorative historic lighting. So what does that do? It's one of those layers that we talk about that gives a signal in your brain that you're in a different place and you're a different time. Because you can, just like I can look at moldings and say, oh, that's from the 40s or that's Georgian or Federal or whatever it is. Lighting's the same way. The colors that they use, the globes, the open bulbs, it's very communicative, right, with that historic lighting. Remember that 1928 Staub house that we worked on? It was a great period revival house, built in 1928, built by a famous architect. It was very original, it's lighting, and there wasn't a lot of can lights and stuff, but the client wanted more lighting than we had. So we actually went in with a square LED light that was small, okay, it was about 3 or 4 inches square, and it was mudded right to the ceiling. And so instead of having a big 6-inch ring stuck in your ceiling, this is actually a light that's much smaller, less obtrusive, less visible, and it kind of goes away, kind of disappears on the ceiling as opposed to having black rings all around your ceiling or black holes. And so that's an example of the advancement of lighting that's happening these days that is making the lighting fixture disappear in some of these modern settings. The other thing that you'll notice today is the scales, particularly outside lights. The lamps that you can get today for the front of a house are ginormous, right? And if you look at the quaint, small little exterior lights that you would see on an historic house from the 20s, it's completely different. The scale might be this big by a front door versus today it's ginormous. So as you're thinking about a new house with an old soul, hopefully it has a narrative, hopefully it has a story, hopefully it has a time and place of when it was supposed to exist. Even if it's a colonial revival house, right? What did they do in colonial revival eras? Candle lights, there was oil lights, there were, ways of decorative lighting, and you're gonna be looking at that catalog of lighting in order to bring in that authenticity and historicity that's going to look so good. So Thistle Hill's this great historic house just around the corner. I'm going to go check it out because I want to show you what lighting looked like, in 1900. We're going to see some knob and tube wiring. It's been upgraded with the new electrical panel, so we're going to see, this transitional change. You're going to notice that there's no can lights. We're going to look at light fixtures and notice the story that they tell. We're going to see how that changes from room to room. We're going to look at the scale of them. All of those things are important clues that can help us as we're building a new house, give it that old soul, right? We're looking at those things for clues for how to build better today. And there is a great house with good examples. Driving over to Thistle Hill, I thought it might be worthwhile to stop by this architectural salvage yard, Old Home Supply, check out some of the lighting from this period, check out the scale and the size, really help you understand what I'm saying about taking us to a different place in time. So let's go check out Old Home Supply. Okay, so we're in architectural salvage yard. We're looking at lighting, and here's where you can see the scale for one. Look at these. These are exterior lights right here. They're really small, especially compared to today's standards where just things would be ginormous. Here's something probably from the 50s or 60s. It too is even big, but look at this little arts and crafts light here. That is, classic as far as the scale and size. What is it, maybe 8 inches by 6 inches? The scale is really changing. The other thing that's happening is that these are very evocative of different styles and different periods. You can almost cast the story of the little coach light here. Look at the kind of European flair here. Looks like a London street light. Look at the Gothic revival and English stuff going on here. So there is clear architectural definition of these lights. Look at these sconces over here. Sconces too are conveying that old European. I know these are from the 20s because they have that period revival feel. Look, we've got ships here, right? That is, probably from the 30s period revival. There's a little castle here. Same thing here with this kind of this old world shield going on here. So not only the scale and the size of these things, small and diminutive, but putting something like this in your house. Imagine putting an antique like this into your house. It really automatically, your mind kind of switches and you go to a different place in time and you're thinking differently about where you are, where you're standing. It changes that time scale and really makes a big difference. The other thing that happens as, chandeliers are certainly something that changes quite a bit. Remember, in these early houses, the only light that was oftentimes in a room was a light like this. Notice what's going on here. These are open bulb lights, okay? So this is how this was meant to look. There was no, cover over top of the light, but that kind of detailing and that plasterwork around that light really communicates a story. Look at this one with the little stars on it. All of these different things take us back to a different time and place. Look at the work that they went to communicate these different canopies that would go on some of those lights. That, this, if you had those bare bulb things, this piece of glass sitting there, that milk glass with the definitive little edge there. There's some Art Deco things here. This one's broken. There's something from the 40s or 50s. These have a clear architectural styling. It's hard to find globes with this much architectural detailing and interest as is found here. And this was just the globes, the offerings and the globes that you could put around a light like we were looking at. So a lot of variety, a lot of opportunity, a lot of different things that help communicate a different story and can really give your new house an old soul. So before we go upstairs and look at some lights, I wanted to show you what the knob and tube looked like. Here's the wire. It's basically a hard wire wrapped in a asphalt impregnated cloth, okay? And you can see where it tied around a knob. So this is the knob and this is the tube. The tube would actually be drilled through a stud or something in the wall and then your wire would go through it. So it'd come through, and they were saying that with expansion and contraction, the tube really helped the wire not get crimped or broken. And then the knob is something that just screws in. So there's a screw right here. It would be screwed right into the ceiling. The wire would come around, it would get tied to this knob. As you saw, this is something that was tied to a knob. And then it became this straight line that would then run across the house. So interesting, these are porcelain. And this was, interestingly enough, considered too labor intensive. And that's why Romex kind of took over in the 30s when it came out. So anyway, knob and tube wiring, the earliest kind of wiring, pretty cool. Now let's go upstairs, look at the lights. So one of the things you're trying to balance with this new house, old soul, is the lighting, right? Look at this room here, okay? No can lightings. We have two switches. We have a main chandelier, quote unquote. We have two small sconces. Now, there wouldn't be enough today. Lighting engineers and lighting designers will go, we need a certain amount of candle power. Well, there's other ways of lighting this space up. You could light the inside of those cabinets, right? We can talk about secondary and third lights. There's obviously not much furniture in here, so lamps would certainly be part of something if you wanted to light it up more. But there is nothing in the ceilings. This huge big room here, again, a chandelier, sconces here, not very much lighting. Now, There is ways today to balance this out for this new house, old soul. I'm showing you kind of what's historical so that you can get a frame of reference for how you want to go about designing. So if this was my space and this was a new house, there would be maybe lighting around the beam, maybe lighting on top of the crown molding there, right? There's a cove there where we could light it up. The great thing about LED is we can really light up a place, right? And so I might have some very well hidden spots, right? You can get the lights that are about this big and hide them in some of the beams, but I'd be working on hiding the lighting in here, but still trying to get as much candle power, as much lighting as possible or as is necessary. I might add more sconces. Sconces are a great historical method for lighting up a space. I might put, 2 on either side of the door, right? Maybe another chandelier, right? I've got my old house frame going on so that I'm thinking about how to do this space without just hitting the easy button going, well, we got to put a bunch of cans in here. Track lighting, the preservationist in me doesn't like track lighting, but the fact is track lighting is very reversible, and there's some track lighting that works great. And so that might be, we tried some spots in some different places, but I'm hiding the lights. I'm not putting a ton of cans in here. I'm choosing decorative lights that contribute to the architectural story of the house, right? So I'm hoping you're getting a sense of kind of how I'm thinking about lighting, because it can make a huge difference on the success of your new house with an old soul. So the last thing is the exterior lighting, right? And notice that on this house, these wonderful coach lights here. That is a small modern day light, okay? So that's probably 16 or 18 inches. Those things get ginormous, and it's kind of part of the look now to have this kind of coach light that's really big. So don't get caught in that fad. It's a dial that you're playing around with so that you can get the right look. This is architecturally pure, architecturally part of the story, and proper scale and proportion. Notice that there is also a little dome light under this porte cochere, this drive-through, right? So we've got another little coach light. Not a ton of lights. Certainly by our day and standard, where code is to have a light by a back door, they don't really have that. So if I was going to introduce a light to this space, right, and this is the new house, old soul, I would be thinking of something very small, okay, very small spot up there that would light this door. I might try to find a coach light that was appropriate, down in scale from that other one. That one's too big. This is a secondary door, something lighter and smaller here. So there are sensitive and creative ways of getting our lighting done without, putting something that just stands out and screams new house. All right, guys, so when thinking about electricity, right, we've got all these changes in electricity. Hopefully some of this communicates to you that a lot of these changes are fairly recent, that these aren't 200-year-old things we're dealing with. They're 30, 40, 50 years old when you think of can lights and you think of these other lighting things. Realize too that there's a lot of fads today. There's a lot of looks. I remember the oil rubbed bronze was such a popular look 10 years ago. Now it looks so dated to have that look. So there's things that kind of go in and out of style. You want to be timeless in your efforts. You want to tell an architectural story. You want to be in the same scale of everything. And so there's a sensitive way of thinking about lighting and a creative way of adding lighting to your house without blowing up your ceiling with a bunch of can lights. So look through those things, fight hard. This is an area where you can really fight hard and get creative, wonderful lighting in a room without having a ton of cans. And so I'm kind of picking on cans, but they tend to be this thing that can really ruin that look. And you walk into these spaces, historic houses, 2 lights in a room, right? Probably we want a few more than that, but we're going to do that with lamps. We're going to do that with under counter lighting. We're going to do that with bookshelf lighting. There's other ways of introducing light in this thing without just throwing cans in the ceiling. So hopefully that helps out. Hopefully that gives you a frame of mind of electricity and what electricity has to do with building a new house with an old soul, and how important those little decisions are that can make a big difference.